Hi, this is the overview presentation for Module 2, and this is on conflict theory. So where the functionalists saw how society operated as a natural, even biological system that assumed neutrality, that assumed meritocracy in school and in other social institutions, conflict theory sees a conflict between those groups in power and those groups that are being exploited. So here we talk about reproduction of social class inequality. So again, social reproduction, and we have a few theorists here, and Marx figures prominently in the Feinberg and Soltis text. So institutions of society serve to reproduce the status quo through largely economic inequality. So when you hear economic, think Marx. But all the other inequalities owe the debt to the philosophy of Marx in identifying conflict, class conflict, and giving them, the other theorists, a lens through which to examine social arrangements. But Marxists are always going to be concerned with wealth or income. And then there are other inequalities of status, race and gender, sexuality, religion, immigration status, ability. So we have other critical theories, including feminist theories, to explain social reproduction, the reproduction of inequality. So here where you ask, what is the role of schools in this process? There might be two, depending on how rosy your outlook is. It's either for a reproduction of a benefit to the dominant class to further social status stratification in a way that's unequal and will always be unequal. Legitimation of the status quo. So inculcating people to believe that the system, the unequal system that we have, is natural in the way that it should be. In other words, teaching people to have a functionalist mindset. Or maybe school could be a site of consciousness raising. And Freire thought about this. Struggles and perhaps liberation. And the other Freirean authors also see it this way. They see that things are unfair, and school, unquestioned, can serve to reproduce inequality, but it can also be one of those sites for transformation. So I provided you with, I think, a few videos in this overall presentation, and you might want to access the PowerPoint so that you can click on the links. I don't think when this converts into a video, you will be able to access the link. So one of the links is to the trailer for inequality. And this is income inequality, sorry. And this is Robert Reich, the former Secretary of Labor and the UC Berkeley professor. He is progressive, but he's a capitalist. And he talks about the way that our system is unequal now, but it hasn't always been. And that rather than looking at other country systems or throwing capitalism away, we should look at the way that we establish laws to distribute income in a way that was more equitable. So you see the chart that was the functionalists used to explain the different classes. Here, conflict theorists see this distribution differently. They see this as something intentionally set either by capitalism, period, that's a strict classical Marxist point of view, or by the legal arrangements. So there are tax and wage laws of unfettered upward distribution of wealth. So this is what Robert Reich will present to you, that the way that we organize our economic system is by a set of laws, and those laws can be changed. They haven't always been this way, and they could change to make income inequality shrink a bit. And this view says that this is going to be better for everyone. This is going to be a healthier economy for everyone because it assumes that the middle class are the drivers of the economy, the people with the purchasing power. And you can see another chart that shows more recently, so this is 2017, the difference in income as earnings. So you get the bottom 90%, right? And then the top 0.1%. It's really skewed. And so you do wonder, even from a functionalist point of view, some functionalists are looking at that and saying, that seems wildly out of balance. That seems like a dysfunction. So maybe they're hoping things just correct themselves. But I think people are sociologists, even from a functionalist point of view, would look at this and say, this is untenable. And we see the responses to this right now. So here we have Marx. I included some images and some quotes so that you can get a little bit more familiar with the authors that you're reading about. I think most people have heard of Marx and have probably seen images of him before, and unfortunately associate him with communism because the communists took up his criticism of capitalism as a way of defending their own their planned economic system. So Marx's philosophy could be called economic determinism. So he says people have no choice because their futures are determined by them for the economic structure and their position within it. So if you are part of the owner class, you're always going to be that. That's going to be part of your future. If you're part of the working class, you're always going to be part of the working class, and that's your future. And it conditions you. Your class position conditions you as well. The structure of the economy takes precedence over human action or agency. So this is less hopeful, more pessimistic about change developing organically, and sees little possibility for individual agency short of collapsing capitalism as a system. So it finds something wrong with the system, the economic system on the whole. It says the economy requires people to take on different work roles. So the functionalists observe this too, set of skills, knowledge, and dispositions. And the economy requires a reserve labor force, both skilled and unskilled, to keep wages low in order to maximize profit for capitalism. So this view explains unemployment as a function of the society, meaning it's not something that everyone is trying to eliminate. Actually, the idea is that we always have a reserve of labor so that the owner class can have more power over their workers. If the workers want to unionize, they want to strike, they want to complain, well, the owners can just say, well, move aside because there's always someone waiting to take your job. So Marx's explanation of social reproduction through the schools says that schools are training the young people for their future economic and occupational positions according to their current social class position. So you're being prepared to be either a worker or an owner. So students of working class origin are going to be trained to take orders, be obedient, and are subject to more discipline. And you read this from Annion's studies, not just one, of schools that serve different classes of students, social classes of students. And the children of professionals are trained using more progressive methods, which gives them internal discipline and self-presentation skills. So you see how not just the way that the students are taught, but the actual content and the material conditions, right? We're usually focused on the material conditions, but Annion's focused here on the way that students are taught and the content that they're taught as being specific for preparing students for their assumed futures. So here's some Marxist terminology. And I don't know if you get this in my vocab sheet. Hopefully you do. False consciousness. So this idea that the members of subordinate groups share the values and views of the dominant class. This explains why there isn't more immediate or constant uprising, because people have bought into the system as it is, and people might even falsely believe that if they work hard enough, they can advance. And Marx doesn't believe that, but he explains compliance or complicity and adopting the values of the capitalists, even admiring them. He explains this as a false consciousness. If we really had authentic class consciousness, we'd understand our position as workers, and we would understand that our labor was being exploited by the capitalists. Hegemony is another idea that you find in Marx and Marxist scholarship. The ideological control over consciousness of a subordinate group by the dominant group. So this is the control of the social institutions. It's not a police force forcing you to adopt the beliefs or to stay in line in society, although when called upon, they can. We have a labor history in this country that demonstrates how the police force can be called out to protect the property of the capitalist class and to control worker strikes and protests. So hegemony is this ideological control. It's the socialization into the values of our economic system, but also into the values of the upper classes. So I want to have these things that you have, and I internalize this largely false belief that if I work very hard, I can have those things too. And I say largely false because reality just doesn't bear this out, right? So there are some people who do advance in class, but by and large, that's not most people. It's really, really hard. Class mobility is really difficult in this country. It's far more likely that we stay in the social class that we're born in. And I'm a class boundary crosser myself, having grown up in the working class and through education moved into the middle class. So it is possible. You'll find people who do it, but it's not a large social reality. And so hegemony is different from what Marxists call the repressive state apparatus. So those are the police, the judiciary, right? The legal system, as we see it, as we observe it, seems to preserve the status quo in favor of those who have and against those who do not. And even if it's not written into laws, and some are, right? We have a harsh history of penalizing people for being poor in our judicial system. Even if it's not part of the law, it somehow has become part of habit, and it influences people's beliefs about guilt and innocence based on who they are, how much money they have, how they speak, how they dress. More terminology. So you've got the ideological state apparatus. So this is schools, media, cultural and religious institutions, the family, that helps perpetuate this, the ideology that supports the superiority of the upper class or the capitalist class in Marxist terms. The law of contradiction. So each social form contains within it the seeds of its own destruction and transcendence. This was the only bit of hope for Marx. So Marx was preaching a revolution. And so he said systems that are unequal will eventually topple, but because they're unfair and they're unsustainable. But he thought that the only way of doing this would be a complete revolution, and that the capitalist system would have to be replaced by the socialist system. Base superstructure, this idea that at the heart of inequality is economic inequality. So the other structures, such as patriarchy, racism, heterosexism, shape and constrain or enable action, but the economic relationships are at the base of all systems of oppression. So that's the base of oppression is economic oppression. And then the neo-Marxists are the people that see changing the relationship to the means of production won't assure the end of all forms of domination. So they're looking at these other structures, at patriarchy, racism, heterosexism. They're looking at the media, the arts, the education, the museums, right? The things that retain the norms that hold the upper classes in a superior position. So these are neo-Marxists. They say it's not all about the economy. So a little bit from Jean Anyon. Let me see if I can move my position here so that you can see her quote. Yeah, I'll just move myself out of the way here for a little bit. So Jean Anyon did the work, the research on the schools that were set up to educate kids from different social classes. And I don't want you to get the idea that this was the school's intention. You wouldn't go into the schools and ask them their mission statement, and their mission statement would be to prepare the future leaders of industry for the affluent school, or to prepare the middle managers and homemakers in the middle class school, or to prepare the frontline workers and the people contributing to our military and the working class schools. You won't see that. This is the way, though, that schools blindly just reproduce the social status system if no one takes action against that. So the observation of these conflict theorists is that the conflict, the reproduction of inequality, is the natural part, and unless we take action, we're going to consistently reproduce that inequality. So here Jean Anyon says, I think my generation and those who followed have changed the understanding of what school is and what it does in society. And she was really influential in helping educational theorists and sociologists see what was going on in schools. I don't think mainstream scholars, politicians, or reformers could argue with legitimacy today that education has nothing to do with the political economic context of schools and neighborhoods. And she's absolutely right. This isn't new to you. I'm sure that what you're hearing now isn't new to you. It's now widely understood that schools an institution that is not socially neutral, but tends to be strongly supportive of the system and its mainstream ideas, and thus those who profit most from these, unless the schools take it as their mission to interfere with this. Okay, so here's one of the videos that I inserted for you, and I don't know if it will play or not. Let's experiment with this. But so this is just a way to illustrate what Anyon was saying about the function of the schools. But children receive an education that reflects the expectations of their class futures. And most children born into the lower classes will not make it out of that class, even when exposed to heroic educators. And this is what is complicated about giving teachers their due. So of all the in-school factors that really matter to kids' success, the teachers are the number one. But there's far more influence from out-of-school factors than there are from in-school factors. And some of the in-school factors work in reproducing inequality too. So even if you have a good school, a great teacher, chances are you're going to stay in the class where you were born. So let's see if this works.
In America, it's better to be born rich than smart. Many low-income whites and racial minorities don't get to be all they can be. If you're born wealthy and have high test scores in kindergarten, you're likely to have high scores in high school and be ready for college. But if you're born smart and poor, your chances are slimmer. Half of poor students with high test scores have fallen behind by 8th grade, compared to 1 in 10 rich students with high scores. Consider 2 kindergartners, one with wealthy parents and low test scores, and one with poor parents and high test scores. Before and during elementary school, one child has access to resources that the other does not. These patterns continue in high school, setting the stage for adult success. The highest performing poor students have less chance of graduating from college than the poorest performing rich students. A student from a poor family who has high test scores in 10th grade has a 4 in 10 chance of graduating from college within 10 years. But a student from an affluent family who has low test scores in 10th grade has nearly a 5 in 10 chance of getting a college degree. The chances are even worse for poor black students than they are for poor white students. By the 8th grade, 6 in 10 poor black students who had high test scores in kindergarten have seen those scores drop, compared to 4 in 10 poor white students. And rich black students are almost twice as likely as rich white students to see their scores drop in the same period. It doesn't have to be like this. Education policy can help level the playing field. Early childhood academic interventions are a crucial first step, but there has to be consistent support along the way. Schools need the resources to provide that support, and they need to be held accountable.
So that's Georgetown University. That's, I would say, a neutral evaluation of the way things are. All right. So I need to move myself out of the way too. So we're moving on to social class system and or social capital theory. I'm sorry, and we're going to be talking about Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu. So, social relationships are resources or benefits. That's what social capital theory says. And pause this right now to see what happened. With my little video. All right, this is part 2, social capital theory. Okay, I think I'm better at moving this around now too. All right. So social capital theory says that relationships have value, have economic value. People are actually able to acquire things through their social networks. And you know this, it's tied up in the maxim, it's not what you know, it's who you know. It absolutely is. It works that way. If you want to read more about social capital, I've linked from the term from the Encyclopedia of Sociology. That's in part of our, there's a link in the Getting Started section. So this is the SAGE Encyclopedia, one of our reference books. It's just simply the value inherent in relationships. So someone's social capital is the value inherent in their relationship. So social capital applies to all social classes. All social classes have social capital, but as you can imagine, the social capital of the upper classes is more directly valuable if you want to monetize that in getting people resources, jobs, access to education, and things like that. And to some degree, we see this operating because of the norm of reciprocity. Sorry. Reciprocity is tit for tat, right? So I do something for you, which means you do something for me, or I can later count on you. So if you're having a benefit to raise money for a cause that you care about, and I show up and I donate, well, chances are good that you're going to feel obliged to me later on, maybe when I want a recommendation, or I want you to help my child do something, or I want you to introduce me to someone that can be helpful for my career. That's the way it works. Information flows and networking. So different classes have different access to information too. So we talk about charter schools having a lottery system, and it seems fair to people unless they understand how networks work and information flows unequally in social classes. So people in middle and upper classes who want a better chance at the lottery will know when to show up, where to show up, how to fill out their applications, and they tend to have a better shot still of getting their students into schools, or in schools where it's supposed to be competitive based on students' merit. Those parents that have more social capital will know how to draw on experiences, grammar, vocabulary, style, presentation to make their child seem more attractive to the school. And then networking, really, actually, maybe, if I'm in a middle or upper class, chances are my network includes someone who's involved in the school or knows someone who's involved in the school. It's just more likely. And so this is recognized by functionalists. This happens, right? That no, there's no one disputing that this happens, but functionalists don't see it as a problem, or rather, they say that it kind of works itself out in the end because they believe in social mobility. So working class people also have networks, and they also have information flows. So when I was working in Pittsburgh in the food service industry, I found out how people were making use of their resources to maximize on their little bits of disposable income. Ride sharing. I found out what a jitney was, right? An unofficial taxi. I found out that people were making copies of bus passes, right? I found out that people were using bartering systems to resell items. So it's not that people don't have the networks, and it's not that they don't have social capital, but they have different social capital and different. Their social capital has different material value. Okay, so the person we most closely associate with social capital theory is Pierre Bourdieu, French, if you can't tell. And I use this and maybe one other image from AZ Quotes, which I think represents the philosophy as applies to education of these folks, because these philosophers had a lot to say that won't necessarily be helpful for you. It's kind of thick when analyzing schools, so I wanted to pull out their point specifically, as Feinberg and Soltis does very well, and then Savadnik did as well. So here Bourdieu says, the point of my work is to show that culture and education aren't simply hobbies or minor influences. They are hugely important in the affirmation of differences between groups and social classes, and in the reproduction of those differences. So here you see his take on reproducing social classes. So he says each class has its own cultural background, knowledge, dispositions, tastes that are transmitted through the family, but not everyone's cultural background is valued the same, and the cultural background of the dominant classes in society are the ones going to be presented in the school. So this cultural background, the knowledge, disposition, and taste, is called the habitus. And he called it this way to signal its deep routinization and naturalness, so our collective habits. But schools require cultural resources with which only some students are endowed, so only the students of middle and upper class families are going to have the habitus that matches that of the school. And like I said, it's the culture of the dominant group always forms the knowledge and skills that are most highly valued and the basis of what's taught in school. So this is another way. You think of the material advantages that middle and upper class kids have over those from lower or working class families, but here's an advantage that those kids have too, and that they share the habitus of the school. And what's worse is schools look like they're neutral in evaluating students, but they're evaluating them based on a habitus that isn't natural to them. So the folks from the dominant group are just more likely to perform better in schools. There's a term here, symbolic violence, and I think that people don't understand this all the time when they see it, and they think that's extreme, violence. That's exaggerating. But Bourdieu said this as the imposition of the habitus by the dominant group onto the subordinate group, establishing a hierarchy of values, beliefs, behaviors, skills, knowledge, and artifacts. So I might not be doing you any physical harm, but I am doing you some kind of, it's a psychological harm, and it is going to result later in a deflation of your imagined chances and your real chances for advancement in society. So to possess that cultural capital means one is considered educated or smart or talented, meaning the cultural capital of the dominant class. To not have that cultural capital means one is considered stupid or ignorant or uneducated. Right? So there's social capital, and then there's cultural capital, and cultural capital is associated with this habitus, and it's more than just our information flows and our networking. So another person that I asked you to read was Paul Willis, and I somehow forgot to put an image of him. I'll have to put an image of him in the module somewhere if I remember. British guy, sociologist, interested in looking at the ways that students self-sabotage themselves in school. So he wrote a book called Learning to Labor, How the Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs, meaning they're participating in the reproduction of the social class stratification. And it's through their resistance to school, their resistant behavior in schools. And John Ogbu observed this of involuntary immigrants as well. So I think people most often question why African American or Latino students behave the way they do as if they have an attitude. They're resisting this cultural imposition. They're resisting this idea of being presented with a cultural hierarchy. And they might not be able to articulate that, but this is what Paul Willis was observing. So, and he was talking about, these are the lads in his study. They're all white working class kids in London, an area of London. So the student resistance to school is a political response to oppression and limited life chances. They understand that they're going to work in the mines or the factories just like their parents are, so they're going to resist the idea that there is something better than that. They're going to resist the idea that becoming educated or going to college is somehow superior to that. They somehow internalize that the idea that the high school diploma isn't going to help them because they're going to get a factory job. I don't think we have the luxury of that. This is 1977. We don't have our kids don't necessarily believe that they can get by without a high school diploma, and most do try to graduate from high school when they can, but yet, we've done a good job of reducing our dropout rate. But you see, now that dropout correlates more closely with ethnic minorities, but then our ethnicity and class correlate so closely, it's really hard So still, we're just talking about class here. So people are able to act, interpret, and have some power in their lives in response to this structure. Foucault later calls this agency. So they're participating in this system. But ironically, their resistance to school doesn't hurt the school. It kind of solidifies their class position and helps to reproduce the social class structure. So I know that you're all familiar with this idea, this peculiar behavior of children that seem to self-sabotage themselves, that reject the idea that graduating is worthwhile, that going to college is worthwhile. And here's Freire. So Freire might be someone that you know. I included just a small picture of him. Freire is probably the person, the philosopher, that has contributed the most directly to teacher education. So he's had an influence in the way that we teach and the things that we assume about our relationships with students. Even though he was an adult educator, he didn't teach small children. He was, in fact, an informal adult literacy instructor, and he worked for social change with adults by teaching them how to read and teaching them a little bit about their situation, having them ask questions and talk to each other about their material conditions. But for schooling, we recognize Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed as observing this way of educating the poor children, and he's writing in a Brazilian context here, through banking education. So we just deposit knowledge into the student's head, and then later the students regurgitate that knowledge back to us. And so this is the 1960s. I think all of us now as teachers value some kind of critical reflection on the way in between banking and regurgitation. He called this dehumanization because it was an education that assumes that the students have nothing, that are bringing nothing of value, and they have nothing, and nothing. They don't know anything, and the education teaches them to want nothing and to be compliant with the system as well. And Freire also observed that the oppressed internalized beliefs. Remember that false consciousness that Marx talked about? So Marx influenced Freire for sure. Although Freire would consider himself, he's no longer living, he died in the 90s, a liberation theologist more than a Marxist. But he said the oppressed internalize the beliefs and the values of the oppressor through messages transmitted by all social institutions, and without interfering with more of a humanizing education, then those oppressed people, if they do get a little bit of power, they're going to turn into oppressors themselves. And this was his big concept for literacy education, reading the word and the world. So literacy is more than just decoding and making meaning of text. It's recognizing your place in society and understanding the causes of social arrangements. So this is what he was interested in teaching. And if you visit the link to the Highlander Education Center, you might at some point come across some footage of Freire teaching there. And you'll see how he worked with adult educators in the community to have them to make a study of the conditions of their work and to ask questions that would drive action for improving their situations. I like this image, and every time I talk about Freire in any class, I always like to use it. So you get the transmission or banking form of education. Look at the bottom. The teacher's transmitting, and some kids learn this way. I learned this way. I did well in school. I think a lot of teachers did well in the school, and this is the sit and get method. The girl in front seems to get it. The second student in the second row is confused but not asking a question, and the kid in the third row is completely tuned out. And then moving on up, the generative method of education is that where the teacher is actually working with the students and the students are working with each other to read the word in the world, to understand what's going on, to ask questions, to describe their environments. And what this leads to is transformative education, a transformative pedagogy, where the teacher actually inspires the children to make real change in their environment. So here they're working on a school garden. And this is a list of the contributions that Freire made to teacher education. So you'll be familiar with these, I'm sure. The whole idea of having groups of group teaching, the whole idea of teachers being learners, the idea of teachers journaling, using journaling and reflection and self-evaluations. Freire is responsible for inspiring our teachers to be public intellectuals and political agents. And, we're in the era now where we have a lot more teachers being politically active and finding their power in solidarity and making real change outside of the school as being political actors and running for political office as well. All right, Michel Foucault. So, as Feinberg and Soltis say, it's hard to place him. He resisted categorization. He was a slippery fellow, someone who influenced me actually in my dissertation work. So Michel Foucault, he called himself a social critic. And he studied several institutions, schools, prisons, and mental hospitals. And he likened them all as being institutions that controlled people by surveillance and normalization. So actually disciplined, right, turned people into the compliant bodies that the institution wanted them to be. So he says that schools serve the same social function as prisons and mental institutions to define, classify, control, and regulate people. Not a rosy view, but here Foucault did see the possibility for agency. He said wherever there's power, there's going to be resistance. So here are these two terms that I don't think Feinberg and Soltis get into, but surveillance. So surveillance, this idea of being watched, and think about prisons, mental hospitals, and schools. That shapes behavior because those being watched then conform to the expectations of the watchers. So this might be what silences teachers who would like to speak up when they see things that aren't right, that are unjust in schools. It's true under conditions of examination too. The examination, again, think of prisons, hospitals, and schools. Students respond with the right answers that will get them praise or high marks, and they learn not to question. They learn not to prize learning as the goal, but rather as getting high marks. And then normalization is this idea that the norming or the regulation of certain ways of being shapes behaviors and beliefs to conform to the expectations of the system in place. And that's always going to be determined by those in power. So an example of this, girls should try to be pretty and sweet. African American boys are overrepresented in special education. And this becomes normalized. The way things are becomes in the minds of the people in these systems the way things should be. But here's the hopeful Foucault. He says agency is productive power which involves resistance, a proactive stance of difference. So just standing out. So the resistance posed by the lads in Willis's study, the gender non-conforming students, boys who don't buy into toxic masculinity, teachers who see themselves as carers and nurturers and people in relationship with students rather than obedient technicians or enforcers of power, or people who are meant to sort students or rank them. So he says resistance is an expression of agency that might be reactive or proactive in relation to domination. So either a condition of self-determination, and oppression, which is a constraint on self-development. This is Iris Marion Young. That's my note there. And she's someone that you will get to read as well. So resistance to domination can be overt or covert, right? So we know strikes, boycotts, sit-ins, teach-in, marches, and other forms of protest too. But it can also be internal or small, such as those in discursive practices, the way that we talk, the way that we write, the stance that teachers take in not talking about education as a policing or sorting or normalizing endeavor. And it's also possible to resist through critique and thought alone, seeing yourself as something different, seeing yourself as more valuable than what the system tells you, seeing yourself as acceptable when you are taught that the way that you act, the way that you believe, the things that you want aren't the things that you should want. Now, sometimes teachers have a problem with the idea of resistance because they don't want their students to resist what they're trying to do. And so the teachers who want to help students, want to learn along with students, might not like this word resistance, and administrators certainly don't like this word resistance, but maybe we can think of it as initiative or questioning or critical thinking, because they prize those skills, right? But we don't phrase it as resistance like these theorists did. And they wouldn't want the students to resist the material when it becomes challenging, but they do want students to resist taken for granted assumptions. They want students to take responsibility for their own learning, and that's resistance to oppression as defined above. So this is the more hopeful Foucault, which you might not encounter in reading him directly, but I'm happy to be here to translate him a little bit for you.